We'll take a look at some statistics and some research that's been done and some data that's been collected on the prevalence of burnout amongst aid workers. We'll look at why burnout is considered an organizational issue, and really trying to kind of support the shift from having it be kind of the onus on the individual who's experiencing burnout, but really kind of shift it to more of an organizational view. We'll look at what we wish our management understood to kind of help foster kind of a more understanding and compassionate culture and relationship with our management. Why our organization feels more like talk than action sometimes. We'll look at some of the barriers, some of the obstacles to really implementing positive interventions, and then breaking down some of those barriers and building up accountability. So we'll go into the overview on burnout. Christoph, if you don't mind. All right, and the next slide. So this, I'm just going to kind of talk through a couple of slides that for those of you that were participants on the last webinar, they're going to look familiar, but again, I would just kind of want to give a kind of a common understanding of of burnout and how we're going to use that in the rest of the presentation. So this is a diagram called the Yerkes-Dodson stress performance curve. It's just meant to show the relationship between stress levels and performance and kind of the optimal performance rates. So if you see in the green area, if we're not challenged, if we're not stressed, we have a very kind of a lackadaisical, kind of a very uninspired view, and kind of our arousal is quite low. But having some stress in our life is really healthy. It contributes to positive growth. But it's really when we get to these areas of orange and red that they're alarming. And when we're in those areas for extended periods of time is when it becomes quite damaging and harmful. And we'll look at some of the effects of that. But so this is just to kind of give us a view and kind of just a visual of that stress is not just it's not a bad thing, but when it becomes too much or too often or too frequent, too intense, and it stays at that level, that's when we start to notice levels of burnout. So we'll go on to the next slide. These are kind of a collection of statements that I've heard from individuals, that I've read in research and documents, and that some of my clients have said that these are when we talk about stress management and looking at barriers and why what keeps people from reaching out or being able to access the support that they need, talking to their management, looking at ways that they can address that this is there's really a lot of common mentality behind that, and kind of how we limit ourselves, and what we tell ourselves for why we shouldn't, why we can't, why we don't want to talk about it, that we have a fear of, that there will be job repercussions, that it's a sign of weakness. So these are really just kind of meant to highlight some of the individual barriers that we have, and kind of the mindset that we have in really being able to reach effective stress management. So we'll go to the next slide, which is the boiling frog syndrome. This is my favorite story. I won't tell it in length this time, but this is just a visual to remind us that stress is because it's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes we know how to interact in stressful situations, and we know how to take a step back and interact with our coping skills and our coping mechanisms and strategies. But sometimes in those really high stress, high crisis contexts, we can allow ourselves to kind of just keep going back to those statements that we tell ourselves as barriers, that I'll be okay if I can just get through this week or next week, or I can't delegate this because no one else will be able to do it. But those kinds of things, those kinds of thinking, and those kinds of things that we say to ourselves, push us into this way of normalizing high stress and allowing ourselves to just kind of settle into it, and not being as alert or as aware of the danger, of the warning signs. And so that's where we have this picture of the frogs, and it's just a story that kind of illustrates how it can happen very slowly, and we don't even realize it until it's too late, and we end up being a frog that's being boiled because it just becomes normal. So we'll go to the next slide. This is just a brief history on the concept of burnout. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I do like to kind of give credit to some of the founding names on the concept of burnout, because it is a relatively new concept, but there's been a lot of work, over the decades, and there's a couple of founders or people who have really contributed significantly to the research and to how it's been presented. And so I just have the slide up there just kind of as a nod to the progress that has happened in the recent decades. The next slide that I want to actually focus on. So this is actually the definition that came out 2018, 2019 with the World Health Organization and also with the ICD, as a way of kind of giving, credence and giving it, an actual definition and calling it kind of a syndrome. And so the definition is something that I think is important to understand. However, I do want to note that I think I said this also in the last webinar, that there's a very specific way that it is presented, and it's in the last. Yeah, it's just the last sentence. So it was where it says burnout refers specifically to phenomena in the occupational context and should not be applied to describe experiences in other areas of life. And while I think there's, meaning in that, where, I think sometimes we can overutilize the word burnout by saying, oh, I'm so burnt out on this TV show, or I'm so burnt out, I'm eating the same food all the time, or I'm so burnt out on, lockdown measures. But burnout, it really is a condition, and it has, a very set way of being defined. But my issue with this now, because of COVID, is that I do think that there are some other elements other than just workplace stress, like home stress, caregiver stress, that I would love to see considered. And I know that there is some discussion and dialogue going on with it, but I would like to see a bit of editing to the definition, but that's just more of a opinion piece. But what I want to focus on are really the three bullet points there. And this is part of the definition that we're going to keep coming back to throughout the presentation on how it's defined and what it looks like. So there's three elements: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job. So again, it's very specific on the work environment or the occupational capacity. And then the third one is the reduced professional efficacy. So we're going to take a look at what some of the signs and symptoms are, just very briefly. So we'll go to the next slide, Christoph. So this is the first PowerPoint, feelings of energy depletion and exhaustion. I'm not going to go through them, but just to give you an idea of what it can look like. The next one is the feelings of job detachment and cynicism. Again, a couple of examples of what that looks like. And the third point is feelings of reduced professional efficacy. And on that note, I will switch to the next topic, which is looking at prevalence of burnout among aid workers. So now that we have kind of a general or common definition or common understanding of what burnout is and how we're going to use it in this context, we want to look at, what kinds of research has been done, what studies are showing, how burnout is different maybe in humanitarian context than in other workplace environments. And so I think if we go to the next slide, this is actually one of my favorite pieces. So I don't know if you are familiar with it. If you're not yet, I highly recommend that you find this document. It's on the CHS Alliance website. You can Google it. It's a really, really nice piece that was done at the beginning of last year under the CHS Alliance, but it was done by with Marianne Clements and Melissa Pitotti, and it's a really phenomenal piece of literature where it really looks at what kinds of research has been done and really kind of collecting it all in one place and kind of establishing, kind of making a case for, why do we need to have you be intentional about, well-being of aid workers and humanitarians. And they take a lens of looking at these three components: people management, mental health, and organizational culture. And while we're not going to be talking about mental health or about well-being in general, I want to highlight this because it does have such a strong tie to burnout. We're talking about organizational culture, occupational, stressors. And so this document, especially if you are in a position of being in HR, or if you're a people manager, you're looking for resources, you want to be able to communicate clearly to your leadership, or to maybe to be able to instigate some more change. This is a really great document. It really has some great, excellent statistics in it as well. So I just want to highlight that, and it's a very dear document to me that I refer to quite a bit. And if we can go to the next one. Oh, and I was just passed a note, and just reminded me to let you know that this presentation will be shared. So you'll have all of the statistics, all of the resources, just in case you miss them. And I don't have time to write things up in the chat, but you'll have all of the resources and links at the end of the presentation as well. So this is just a snapshot, prevalence of of burnout among aid workers. And so this is based on a study from Liza Yakins, who's a researcher, and she has done several pieces on researching the psychological well-being of aid workers, and has really contributed a lot to this area of focus. And these statistics were from one of her studies, and it just shows, if you can see, I mean, this is really just mirroring the WHO definition with the same 3 bullet points from top to bottom. So if you look at the top one, we're talking about the high emotional exhaustion. And she found in her studies that it was 32% rate. And then she has it nicely broken out, the differences for men and women. And then the same for the next 2. So this is the high depersonalization and cynicism. And then the last one, which was the highest, was the low personal achievement, and also that, that feeling of efficacy. So this is just the first of the statistics that we can look at to understand how prevalent it is within the sector. And on to the next slide. This was actually taken from the CHS mapping that I had just shared a little bit ago. And this is a quote from, I think it was actually from an article. Oh, there it is, from The Guardian. The Guardian actually has a series on kind of stress and burnout in the NGO sector, if you're interested in more reading. But this was taken from a study that they had sourced from the Global Development Professionals Network. And I found this one really alarming, that 79% of respondents stated that they had mental health issues, but that 93 of those aid workers believe that the problems are related to their work, which is a huge indicator of how that correlation between workplace environment, occupational stress, and mental health issues, which, again, if we go back to the WHO definition and the condition of burnout. So that was just another statistic I wanted to highlight for you. If we go to the next slide. So these next 2 slides that I have are actually based on data that I've collected. It's not research. This isn't an extensive study, but it's actually based on a survey, that I do with my clients in coaching environments, and also that I do in workshops and trainings. And so an exercise that we do is to establish kind of a subjective scale of what they feel their stress is. So we look at a scale of 1 to 10, and I know that my hands are reversed in the camera. But if we look at a scale of 1 to 10, and then in that exercise they identify what kinds of symptoms are normal for them, what kinds of expressions and behaviors are normal, and then what they consider for themselves to be an extreme expression of stress, and that would be their indicator. And so it's meant to kind of give them a very personalized scale, so that they can be very aware of where they're at on that, and to kind of have those inbuilt mechanisms and some accountability for themselves. So based on the scale that we develop in those contexts, I broke them down into 4 categories of low stress, moderate stress, high stress, and burnout. So this, based on the survey, so it's 277 aid workers. These were the numbers. So they're quite high between the high level of stress and the burnout. So this is where they felt they were kind of the area that they were living in the most of the time at the moment that they did this survey. I will say that my survey is quite they might be skewed a bit, because the participants are people who typically come to me for support or for training, who are already engaging and looking for kind of that extra support for stress. So they're probably skewed a bit. So just kind of keep that in mind. But regardless, I think they are still quite alarming. And on the next slide, Christoph, we can just pop over. And then this is just a breakdown, again, similar to the WHO definition with those 3 bullet points. The first one, feelings of energy and depletion and exhaustion. The second, feelings of cynicism. And the next is the reduced efficacy. So that's just a breakdown for you to see, how people kind of perceived, that they were experiencing symptoms that fall under those categories. So they're, roughly they're about at least 1/3, if not, half or a little bit more, even if you just look at the first, like the top 2, the always and the often. So again, a bit alarming, but they are kind of in line, with a lot of the other numbers and statistics that we see. So I just wanted to highlight some of those. One other, it's okay, you can go to the next slide, Christoph, thanks. Before we go to the next one, there is one other statistic that I was just reflecting on from a webinar that was done a few months ago on mental health and humanitarian workers. And I think Liza Yakins and Gemma Holdy and a couple others were being interviewed as a panel. But Liza shared another statistic that I thought was quite remarkable, was this correlation of trauma. So of an individual who experiences trauma, they're 2.7 times more likely to have PTSD. If they experience trauma and they have occupational stressors, they are 6 times more likely to experience PTSD. So that number doubles. You experience trauma, it's already significant. But then if you have a very severe occupational stress level, then that rate can double. So I thought that was a really remarkable statistic that I wanted to share as well. But and again, I'm echoing Liza's words, so these aren't my own, but the observation from that is occupational stressors, organizational stressors, these are things that we can be a bit more aware of and be intentional about designing and implementing strategies to kind of combat the effects that has on an individual. So I think on that note, then we'll go to the next slide. So why burnout is an organizational issue, which I think we just kind of made the case for there. We go to the next slide. Oops, let me catch up there. Okay, so we talk about the stressors in two families. We have organizational stress and occupational stress. Occupational stress, these are really the stressors that come from a very specific job or a very specific environment that we don't always have a lot of control over. So I did list out some examples, and I did this to try to highlight, why burnout and stress is such a different animal, in the humanitarian context versus other contexts. So we have lists of occupational stressors and some examples then of organizational stressors. I won't go too much into this. But for organizational stressors, maybe I'll just sit for a moment on this one, because this is what we're going to dive into a bit more. So things like harassment and bullying, constant change in demands. And so we see this a lot with emergency contexts. When funding gets cut, there's a lot of changes that we can't control, but there's also a lot of changes in demands on how an organization develops their policies to kind of support that. I mean, these aren't new concepts. They've been happening this way for decades, and so we kind of expect that there are policies and procedures in place to kind of support and buffer the impact that has on individuals. A culture of emergency. This is really just kind of saying, that we get used to just viewing things in a crisis state. We don't really know how to redefine things in kind of a normal or kind of an at ease state. And so there's just this kind of always, constant crisis feeling. Limited communication and information. This is often illustrated in communication between field offices and headquarters. That there's not always the same kind of flow of communication. Lack or excess of supervision. So this can be anything from micromanagement to just having, your supervisor, quit one day or be gone one day, for one reason or another. These things are very upsetting and they cause a lot of stress, and they don't always, these are things that we actually can be a bit more intentional and proactive with in identifying and building strategies to support staff when these things happen. Long working hours in stressful contexts, superhero culture. I've heard it mentioned several times as kind of a macho culture, which I think is quite common to call it, but I'm not a fan of the word. But it's just this idea that, as humanitarians, we are supposed to be kind of this, invincible and strong and, impermeable to things like stress. And so that kind of expectation, builds a stigma and fear around, being able to discuss openly. So this is also something I think that is an organizational stressor. Again, not a comprehensive list on either side, but just some examples that I think are helpful to help us understand where we can have impact. So if we go on to the next slide. So top reasons for burnout. So this is taken from a Gallup poll in January of last year. And Gallup has also done a great series on burnout and kind of putting the onus back on the organization, which I tried to highlight actually recently in some LinkedIn posts, but they had a 3-part series that really elaborated much more on this. But on a poll that they conducted, these were the 5 top reasons that were stated by those that they surveyed. Unfair treatment at work, unmanageable workload, lack of role clarity, lack of communication and support from their manager, and unreasonable time pressure. So I think that's applied, across the board, whether you're in a humanitarian context or not. But, again, all of these are organizational stressors. So the top 5 reasons for burnout, according to the Gallup poll here, are all organizational stressors. So that means that there's an ability to control them. There's an ability to identify them, to go upstream, and really to try to find ways to cut them off. And it's not just putting Band-Aids on burnout and on highly stressed individuals, but we can go back to looking at the organizational culture and those particular stressors and being a bit more intentional with how we build our organizational culture. So if we go on to the next slide. Okay, and this is taken from the areas of work-life model. So this is from Christina Maslach and her colleague. Christina Maslach is someone who I had put up on the timeline of burnout, and she's really been very instrumental. She developed the Maslach Burnout Inventory, the MBI, which is an assessment that's widely used even today. So that was several decades ago, but she did a lot of in-depth work, and these are really the 6 common risk factors that she and her team identified as being having the most significant impact. So again, a lot of this is organizational stressors. So it's very similar to the findings in the Gallup poll. So we have work overload, lack of control, insufficient reward, absence of fairness, lack of community, conflicting values. So I actually want to just take a moment before we continue, but I just want to take a couple of minutes and open it up to either chat or to questions, maybe contributions, and what you kind of think about this. Does this resonate with you, for those of you that are managers, that are these some of is this what you're hearing from your staff that you are supervising, or if you're an individual that's dealing with stress and burnout, which of these resonate the most with you? So I don't know if there's anybody on the chat or that wants to have a minute to share. Try to open the chat.
Kate, you're talking there about common risk factors for burnout generally.
Yeah.
Are you going to look, or do you have a kind of a slide for burnout for aid workers? I mean,
yeah,
living in conflict areas,
lack
of knowledge or language, context, war going outside the front door. I mean, there can be a lot of other drivers for aid workers.
Yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. And I think these ones, because we're kind of looking at kind of organizational stressors, some of what we're talking about, with the very specific humanitarian context, if we go back and we look at some of those are occupational stressors as well. And so I think, we have a question in our discussion point in the second part of the webinar, of the presentation, that we can kind of unpack that and kind of have a bit more interaction, because I'd like to hear from other people, which ones have ring true, which ones do you think should be added to this list if we go back to there. Oh, thanks, Christoph. So some of these are included, but they're very generic, Des. So I think it's definitely a valid question, but I would love to hear more specifics from individuals on where you think this can be kind of elaborated, and also not just for our context for the presentation, but also, these are things that we can start being very, as we share them, we can raise more awareness, with for ourselves in our context, but also with our managers, and kind of developing, a list of how to communicate some of these stressors to our management. So I don't have like a specific list other than for the common risk factors for the organizational stressors, but I think some of these are the occupational stressors that we can ask maybe a more broad question to the audience in the discussion point. Would that be okay? Yeah, we can develop a list there. Great, thank you. Are there others?
If I could make a comment. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Colleen.
Hey, I'm working in Bamako in Mali for the UN peacekeeping mission, and I would say, as a staff counselor, the thing that I heard very often throughout the pandemic was lack of acknowledgement. I forget how on the next slide you had it, worded slightly differently. Yeah, I don't see it there, but so really, like, lack of acknowledgement was something. Insufficient reward. People didn't actually really necessarily want to have huge rewards or huge thanks or anything like that. But they wanted to be appreciated for, you could have gone out on an emergency flight, but you stayed, for 6, 7, 8, 9 months, and, just no general acknowledgement, not extra acknowledgement, not you're doing an amazing job, but hey, thanks for like being part of the team.
Yeah.
And I can comment as well as a manager for myself, the systemic issues that even as a manager, a mid-level manager that I have no control over, that is, inordinately stressful. It's so stressful for me to be understaffed by a couple of people because, of things beyond my control, something that I consider unacceptable, so those are things that, I've observed and experienced that I wanted to share.
No, great, thank you.
I have a question. So how would you, what would you recommend? Like, I totally see what you mean and totally agree to everything and the organizational factors. Would you say, okay, get together in your teams and work from bottom up, solve it in your team, bring that to your manager, the manager brings it to the next level and the next level, and the next level. Any ideas on an approach? Thank you.
Yeah, Jonas, thank you so much. That's a great question. We're actually going to, in the next section, we're going to start looking at, how we would like, for management to understand, different perspectives, how we can kind of understand management as well, and start looking at the very tangible ways to kind of create that culture, but also understand, types of processes that are going to be effective in those contexts. It's not just about, providing, online yoga class or, wellness and well-being workshops or trainings, but it's a much larger issue. It's a workplace environment, it's an organizational environment and organizational culture. And so, some of these are quite, they can be quite specific with work overload, lack of control, but it's looking at, one idea, I guess, this is how I work with organizations when we're trying to kind of figure out ways to build a strategy is we do some reverse brainstorming. And so for reverse brainstorming, one example could be if we take work overload, instead of brainstorming ways to support a better workload, we look at, okay, so how do, if we were going to keep a work overload, what kinds of things are we going to do to, and it's kind of counterintuitive because we have to look at the negative impacts. What are we doing that is contributing negatively to this element of work overload? And so it's kind of reverse brainstorming, and then you kind of reverse engineer on identifying, what those elements are that can be controlled. So it's kind of a roundabout way to do it, but it also kind of takes some of the pressure off of just having a very quick Band-Aid fix and saying things like, okay, well, we'll try to reduce this and we'll try to reduce that, but there's not actually accountability, I guess, built into that. So we're looking at strategies. If you're looking at working with your team from an organizational level, whether it's HR or management, but really taking the time to kind of dive into what are those key elements that are contributing to each of these factors. And I think for organizations that are going to go through this process for themselves, I think it's very important to actually get the feedback of their staff and of their teams. So doing something like a pulse survey or something that's a kind of a confidential feedback mechanism where you can actually get that very concrete feedback on how staff from the HQ office, field offices in different countries, contexts, and cultures, are experiencing stress and how they experience, these risk factors, and really get their input to start off the process. Sorry, it's kind of a long answer to your question. All right. Are there others? Maybe we can take one more before we head on. Reverse engineering. Thanks, Pete and Tom. All right. I do see comments in the sidebar. Thank you. From Varner, one's agency can often be more of a disaster than the context where you're located. Yeah. And absolutely. To JMF 18, I think internal and individual factors related to expectations, personal traits, past experiences, and that this is actually coming up in one of the next slides as well. We look at how we, what we want our managers to understand about us, and that we are individuals, and that we have, these different things going on with us, and how to, how we want them to be able to incorporate that. We don't expect our managers to be superhuman either. However, some of these things come up as really contributing to stress. So thanks for that. All right, Christoph, let's go back to the slides. I'm gonna close my chat window. All right, so what we wish management understood. And I was kind of taking a little bit of a poke at management, even though I have a feeling that most of us are actually managers ourselves. And so, but we also have managers. So even if we are, responsible for the supervision of, staff and teams, we also fall into the cycle of having management. And so it applies across the board. So let's take a look at the next slide. So I kind of broke this down a couple of, I guess, summary statements that I hear often, again, with clients in organizations and in coaching. Is what is it that they want from management? What do they want management to know? And so this was really something I think that comes up really often, is that we need them to invest in their own interpersonal skills, and that the management skills and the the very technical skills are important and they're good, and we know that there's training for those, but it's in some of those, I don't want to even call them soft skills, but it's really in those types of interpersonal skills where the relationship and the connection is formed, and to really be very intentional with how they're developing that for themselves. For some, it comes much more easily. For some, there needs to be a little bit of coaching and coaxing, but these were the ones that probably come up the most often. So for communicating, leading, being protective of their staff and teams, protecting them from outside threats, being resourceful, being approachable, gratitude. So Colleen, this goes back to your comments. Thanks and praise, and really sometimes we don't even really need that. As you said, Colleen, that we don't really need that profound moment of things or praise, but even just for that to be acknowledged sometimes, because a lot of the work that we're doing, especially on the field, where there's a lot of sacrifices, there's a lot of compromises, and staff are being asked a lot of, and so sometimes even a little acknowledgement can go a really, really long way. Training, so being very intentional about how they have an eye on career development for their staff and for their teams, being in and investing in them and just being aware of it, and also being trusting. I think this is probably the most common, probably could have gone under first or second at the top there with communicate, but also to be trusting, and I think that this is a hard one. I think there's when there's, especially in emergency contexts and in very complex environments, there's such a pressure to have, be very result oriented and meeting, project deadlines and budgets, and having to be accountable to donors. And there's a lot of, this high stress and frustration. And so I think it's very hard to let go of micromanagement tendencies, and allowing your staff and your team to feel trusted and to feel capable, and to feel supported. And so I think that that's something that really goes a long way. I think once you start micromanaging, it really breaks down the trust, and that's a very, very steep decline in the well-being, and a very high escalation for stress as well. So these were just a couple of the most common ones that I hear from clients. The next kind of summary statement is, we are all different and want to be treated that way. Oh, we have different fonts there. So we're all different, we're all unique, and we all interact with our environments and with each other very, very differently. We have different work styles and environments. Some of us work better in a collective environment, some work better from home, some work better with kind of a combination. But just if where managers can be flexible with that, and just kind of have an understanding of what type of an environment suits their staff, and how to kind of facilitate that, because that's where they're going to be the most productive. And managers want their staff to be productive, and staff, we want to be productive. We want to be contributing and have meaningful work. But context and environment has a big role to play, and that's come up so much, especially in this past year with COVID and the huge shift from to work from home environments, and how people have struggled with that, kind of balancing it, and being very much aware of how their workplace environment, whether it's in an office or at home, affects their capacity to work, whether they're introverted or extroverted. So this can kind of have an impact on how a manager sets expectations for them being involved in team dynamics, and in team building. Cultural differences, definitely, I think this goes without saying, but probably needs to be said more often. That cultural differences really can make or break a team, and really taking time to understand what's important in a culture that you're working in, and of the cultures of people that you're working with. It's also just kind of common courtesy and sign of respect, and that also goes a long way to contributing to people feeling valued and respected. Next are the personal factors that you were just asking about as well. So personal health and family, a lot of those things that, I don't think people in general are asking for a lot of exceptions to be made, but just to be considered, that those things are in mind of their managers, and of management when, decisions are being made. And another one was just having a mind on different career ambitions. Some of us as staff were very ambitious and want to go far and fast, and others are we're very content. And so that also has a strong impact on how management and leadership interacts with staff. Having an idea of where to kind of develop and build and provide opportunities. So these are just a couple examples. Again, none of these lists are comprehensive, but just to give an idea of how workplace culture, how your interactions with your management and or leadership can contribute to those stress levels. And so the last statement that I have here is that we are humanitarians, not numbers or robots. And so the examples under this one, oops, if we can go to the next one, Christoph, there we go. All right. And so this, again, is just kind of drawing back to the element of we're human, and we have this need to be treated, as, in a, with humanity and with integrity. And so even though, some of those the drivers that, encourages, or that kind of is behind people making the decision to go into the humanitarian work, is that passion and these ideals and their commitments to the values of the work. And they are, but there's also sometimes, unfortunately, an expectation that people should sacrifice extensively to do that. And so I think that's something that comes up a lot, is that even though we're committed, we shouldn't have to sacrifice, to prove it. That we are worth our work, that we want our managers, our leaders to also be our advocates as well, whether it comes to pay scales and, and equity in that, whether it comes to equity in benefits, and insurance and contracts, and for, to feel like our managers are also, advocating on our behalf. We want to be told the truth, the good, bad, or the ugly. I think this one comes up a lot, especially when there's organizational restructuring, which I think is a pain point for a lot of individuals and a lot of organizations, that, when organizational restructuring happens, and it happens often, that they feel like they don't know what's going on. They don't know why things are happening. They don't feel included, and it hurts. It feels like they're not trusted and not respected. And that also is very detrimental to a feeling of, of stress, in the organizational culture. We want to be listened to and attempted to be understood. We want to feel included. And this isn't just a token like, oh, please tell me your thoughts, and then you're going to go off and do your own thing anyways, but to be very intentional about asking for the feedback, of staff and teams. And so, as I gave the example, some things you can do are actually get a pulse survey to really understand confidentially the climate and kind of how staff teams are feeling, and to be very intentional about using that data to make changes. I actually did sit in an organization once where we did put out a pulse survey. It was a regional approach, and I sat in a senior management team meeting that we were reviewing the results, and I heard our management actually say, like, well, this doesn't really apply to us. This is probably just situational. And they really, I heard excuse after excuse on why they weren't going to take the data that they just collected, and they built this expectation, with the staff and with the teams, that we care, we care about your thoughts, we care about your stress, we care about what's important to you in your understanding of our organizational culture. So they created this expectation, but then they excused it, and kind of found a way to get out of any accountability and any action. So to do it, but do it in a genuine way. And then the last one is that we can accept changes, just tell us why they're happening. And again, this goes back to, organizational changes and organizational restructuring. Is we have a great capacity to adapt and to be flexible. I think this is one of the biggest, parts of the nature of a humanitarian, is that we can flex with such, shifts and emergencies and stress. And even though this is a part of how we learn to behave and learn to act, it's really important to understand why. What's going on behind that. If you tell me why, then I'm a lot more flexible. I'm ready to support you. I can get behind you. But if you're expecting me to change and not kind of telling me, the purpose of it, then it also kind of creates that sense of mistrust. And again, this goes back to kind of the detriment of how an individual kind of senses their well-being and how they're respected and valued within an organization. So these are kind of some of the common comments that I hear. If we can go to the next one, and notes from the management. So I was kind of poking a little bit at, managers and leadership and management in general. But, again, a lot of us are managers. We have experienced, management of others. And I know for myself, I have made mistakes. I have caused stress in others, unfortunately. I've learned, hopefully, I think I've learned from my lessons, but, no one's perfect. And so I just wanted to include this as not excusing, poor management or poor leadership or poor support for staff and teams, but just to kind of create some understanding, on different sides, and give a little bit of perspective that for humanitarian contexts, especially, oftentimes managers are experiencing their own challenges with management. And again, not that excuses how they're able to interact with their own, with their staff and with their teams, but it's something that recognizing that we're all kind of in this chain gives a bit more, perspective and humanity to it. There's a high rate of management turnover. There's a high rate of turnover anyways within the sector and, within certain positions. And so with that turnover, there's a lot that is lost, especially in institutional memory. So anyone that's new that's coming in, especially to a management position, is scrambling to catch up. And unfortunately, it's the staff and the teams that often pay the price. But so I think, understanding that there is a steep learning curve, and again, not that it's an excuse, but just, again, just trying to give some context and some perspectives. And also, I think this is what I hear often with clients as well, is that, interim managers may not even want to be in a management position. They may be placed there just because of an emergency, because there was a last minute, someone who didn't take the country director job, decided to bail and take another position, or someone, quit suddenly. And, to fill in that gap and to provide leadership, sometimes the Band-Aid fix is to bring someone who is most familiar with the context, who may not have management skills, may not have gone through management training, to put them in an interim, management position. And oftentimes interim management turns into indefinite management, and it can be a very long, protracted situation. So these are just considerations, as you're trying to find strategies of, whether you're from an organizational view or whether you're an individual struggling with this, just keeping these things in mind can help you develop strategies that are going to be much more effective. So I had another note that I was actually going to ask for your feedback as well, but I kind of want to get through the rest of the slides, and then we'll leave the discussion for the end in a more collective environment. Okay, so the next one, thanks, Christoph. Why are organizations feel like more talk than action? Okay, so we can go to the next one, Christoph, actually. So this one is just looking at, is there really anything behind the talk? I think that there's a lot of dialogue going on. We see a lot of posts, a lot of advocacy messages, whether it's on LinkedIn, maybe it's within your internal email that's circulating about messaging on the self-care and staff care, and that we take it seriously, and this is a priority for us. And it's one thing to have the kind of the messaging out there, but if you don't have any policies or procedures or strategies, or the culture, that really backs that up, then it's not felt by those who it's meant to be felt by. And if that's not happening, then it's not meeting the purpose, and it's kind of a moot point. So, but where is this coming from? So where is this kind of talk coming from, and what is out there? So I've listed here a couple of more examples. Again, these will be in the resource list that gets sent out to you afterwards. But these are just 3 examples. This is an exhaustive list. Again, they're just 3 examples that I refer to a lot. One being the Core Humanitarian Standard on Quality and Accountability that was put out by CHS, which is the Core Humanitarian Standard. So it's CHS Alliance, which I think used to be HAP, and it was combined HAP and People in Aid, I think. So they put this out. I like this one because this actually gives, so they actually have, I think, 9 standards, and the 8th one has specifically to do with providing quality care, and kind of looking at the correlation between providing quality care and support to staff, and how that impacts ultimately their goal of providing quality support to communities, and beneficiaries and affected populations. So under that Core Humanitarian Standard, so again, Standard 8, if you're going to look it up, does have some really concrete examples, on how to measure that, and measure the support that organizations are putting into their staff. And so I think it's a really good example I wanted to draw to. The next one, guidelines on mental health and psychosocial support in emergency. Okay, this is the ISC, so the Interagency Standing Committee on Mental Health and Psychosocial Support. So this was put out, it was more than a decade ago, and I think that there have been some revisions, but it's a great document, and it's something that was very early, one of the earlier documents that really kind of raised awareness for the need for psychosocial support for staff and for volunteers. And then the next one that I have is Guidelines for Good Practice, Managing Stress in Humanitarian Workers. And this was put out by the Antares Foundation based in Netherlands a few years ago. So these I just listed as kind of giving evidence to, there is a lot of talk going on. There's a lot of organizations that are trying to raise the standard, raise the bar, elaborate on duty of care, and really push organizations to take it seriously, and to not just have empty messaging. And there really is a growing body of research. I had mentioned some of the people earlier in regards to burnout in the sector, Liza Yakins and Gemma Holdy. There's many others. I mean, there's just a couple of top names that are kind of ringing in my head because of a webinar I just watched, but there are several researchers who are really contributing significantly to provide significant data that helps to communicate to leaderships and to management and organizations on why it's important. It's not just about the bottom line. It's not just about saving money, but what are the other, how does that staff turnover and burnout and well-being, how does that impact an organization? And so really creating a very concrete case on how to communicate that, and how to really advocate for organizations to take it seriously and to do something about it. I just like this quote. This is just asking the question if having these researches and studies and guidelines are enough. And there was a quote, it's actually taken from the CHS mapping that I mentioned earlier. And it's a quote from Emmanuel Lacroix, who formerly worked with the CHS Alliance, and saying that the guidelines are only as good as how you adapt them to the context. They need to be contextualized and reviewed and updated based on feedback, and the changing context has to be a living thing. So even when we do, have policies and procedures in place, like it's not just a one-off. Like, it's because our the emergency contexts are always very different, and they're always changing, that we need to be able to adapt them, and to be able to revisit them. And they continue to grow as evidence continues to support that. So the next slide, why is change so slow? I think this is a frustration point, because many people feel that their organizations have been talking about this for years, and they're not seeing the change that they hoped to see. So I think, just understanding elements of change, and what are the contributing factors to that. And I won't go through this list, you can read it at your leisure, but just understanding that to change an organization, let alone change organizational culture, is a huge undertaking, and it really requires a lot of patience, a lot of perseverance and persistence, and really having a couple of key people who already have that as that kind of like their advocacy voice, and really being willing to stick with it, and to walk through some of these different procedures and processes to make sure that it's a very genuine change. Change doesn't happen fast, and if it does, it usually doesn't stick. So for lasting change, for durable change, we really want to see very intentional processes put in. So along those lines, for creating meaningful change in workplace culture, this is just a kind of a model that I use with organizations that I'm working with as a consultant on staff care and well-being, when we're looking at how to kind of make those shifts, in their culture, and what kinds of messaging do we want to put out there? What kinds of policies need to be put in place? So really quickly, oh, wow, I've got a lot of slides to go through. So creating space, allocating resources. This is, short story. This one is just, you show that something is a priority when you allocate resources. The biggest resources that you have, whether as an individual or as an organization, are time and money. If you're not allocating time and money, if it's not showing up in your budget, if it's not showing up on your calendars, how do your staff know that it's a priority? So you want to create space and allocate resources. Again, that's a whole other process, but it's just one kind of key point. Collect intentional data. So again, this kind of goes back to collecting data, not just using the research that's already out there, which is important and it's great, but you want intentional data that focuses on your organization and the key or the unique needs of your staff and of your team. So doing things like those pulse surveys, having confidential feedback mechanisms, and encouraging dialogues and how to extract the information that's going to make it meaningful, to really make an impact with leadership and management. Change management, we'll look at a little bit in the next slides, is just kind of understanding the concepts and the principles of change management. It doesn't happen overnight. What are some of the elements that you need to be looking at strategically, and how do you develop those, and even developing indicators to show that you're actually moving towards that? And then the last one is communication. Communication. I'm an advocate for over communication, because I think that it gets a lot gets lost. A lot of communication can get lost in emails, over time zones. Not everyone is on the same call or receiving the same information. And so it's just, how can you focus your communication so that it's not just about, top down messaging, but it's only communication when one party is speaking and the other party is receiving. So if the other party is not receiving the message, then it's not communication. So it's really taking a very critical look on how organizations communicate. So we'll pop over to the next one. Thank you. Here we go. This is just one example of what change management principles look like. So it's being very clear to define and align goals, determine impacts of those affected, which again comes back to really having a very critical look at the changes that you want to make and how that's going to affect people within the organization. Developing communication strategy, and measuring the change process. I think this is key. Going back to indicators and just showing, not just saying that we're making changes, but showing, with your resources, but also showing the progress and communicating the progress, setting milestones and communicating that, and also celebrating that within the organizational culture helps a lot. We can go to the next one. Thanks. Okay, the next one, and then we're getting close to discussion time and break time. Okay, so breaking down barriers and building up accountability. So on this, we just wanted to take a little bit of time to look at some of what are the common barriers of being able to address stress and burnout in the workplace, and then how can we encourage management to take practical steps to address that. So if we can go on to the next slide. All right. So these were just a couple of examples, again, just based on conversations that I have. So identifying what some of the barriers are. A lot of times, whether it's management or of a team or management of an organization, the same can be applied. So feeling like there's a lack of time, that it takes too long to create change. So if it takes too long, then it takes too much money and it's not worth it. Somehow, just somehow falls a bit further along on the priority list. Identifying barriers is also considering stigma and sense of fear. And this is I think this can be applied for anyone as well. That there's this, going back to this superhero culture, this macho culture, and this expectation that humanitarians should be strong and impermeable and averse to stress. And once we start talking about it, then we have to acknowledge that it exists. And if it exists, then we have to look at the causes. And if the causes, are from the organization, then it stings. It can sting a bit. So there's definitely a sense of stigma and a sense of fear from an organizational standpoint, but also from an individual standpoint. Fear of, if I bring up my desire, to address, stress and burnout, that I have to acknowledge that this is an issue. Does it reflect poorly on me? Am I at risk for losing my job? So again, it varies from the individual to the organizational, but it's certainly similar for both. Next is feelings of guilt. I think this, maybe managers, you feel this as well, but as individuals, we have feelings of guilt that we should be doing better, or we should be doing more, or that we're failing someone. And so that, I think that can be a big barrier. Lack of financial resources goes back to lack of time. And I think I have a slide later on that will talk about that. Organizational change and addressing stress and burnout doesn't have to be high cost interventions. These can, of course, it comes to time, and who's going to be responsible for it, who's going to be the holder of, or the custodian of some of these shifts and changes. But it doesn't have to be high cost. There is an investment, but we hope that it's worth it. But so just helping organizations to look at their financial capacity differently. Organizational culture, so looking at what are the elements, of the existing culture that may be impeding openness to addressing stress and burnout. One example, one activity that I do with organizations is looking at like an organizational chart. And if you look at an organizational chart, not with names of individuals, but maybe departments, right? So if we just look at a very large organizational chart with the different departments and the different, sub offices, and you can kind of do an assessment by, and I just start to identify bottlenecks, and just look at each component of how does this, department feel about, what we want to do with, addressing stress and burnout. And, maybe we color it yellow or red or green and just kind of indicate, their level of openness, or their, if it's a priority for them or not a priority for them, or what if they have major issues. So looking at an organizational chart and doing like a color coding of departments or of key roles can help you also understand where you want to focus some of the attention for shifting organizational culture and the attitude, and really investing there instead of places that are already very open to it. Next one, access to support. So this is also, this I think varies quite a bit, especially for field offices, for offices that are in different countries, different cultures, that don't have the same sort of access, to support. They don't have the, oftentimes the support that organizations try to provide, even if it's well-meaning, can be inadequate, or inappropriate for certain cultural contexts. And so I think it's really important to be very contextualized with how organizations are providing support. Again, I had a question here that was going to open it up for discussion, but I'm going to pass on that for now. Okay, so here are some concrete examples of how organizations and managers can be intentional about trying to prevent burnout. So I think this goes back, Jonas, I don't know, I think that might have been Jonas's question. But just giving some examples, on how do you kind of talk with your team about addressing this, or how do you talk with your organization, and where do you give them some concrete ways to start enforcing, not enforcing, but engaging and encouraging. So I won't read through the list. I think you can probably read through it. Just want to get through the slides. So anyways, a few not comprehensive lists, but some key examples. The next slide. Tips to encourage accountability. And this just comes from past projects that I've worked with organizations on. And, when we do brainstorming of, some effective ways on how they're going to show, and communicate widely throughout the organization on how they're trying to prioritize staff care and well-being, and to kind of counter the effects of stress and that lead to burnout. One is that they have started to include stress and burnout awareness in their management trainings. It doesn't have to be a lot, but even just a module on kind of the understanding and awareness of stress, but also of the role of management in kind of the workplace environment, and how to really start to encourage managers and leaders to take on some of those elements that we saw earlier in the presentation on what we want our management to know about us, and how they can start to apply them, including relevant KPIs, so key performance indicators, in organizational annual planning. So even just starting to add, one KPI about, how are we, being accountable to our staff, and to our, to their well-being, how many presentations, are we providing, or what kind of training are we providing? So not just, some surface level, workshops, but really finding some very intentional indicators to start to implement, even if it's slow, something at least shows that there's an intentional investment, including budget lines specifically for staff care and well-being. Again, just an example, but going back to the fact that if you're not showing, with your time and with your money, with your finances, that, these are your biggest resources. If you're not willing to put your resources on the line to back what you're saying, then it doesn't go very far. So this is just one example of just including budget lines. And then another one was to include feedback mechanisms for stress and burnout, and just starting to create a safe space, to create, that culture that says, we understand that there is, fear and stigma around this, but we want to be aware. And so understanding that people may not, want to come forward face to face, especially if there's tension, within the management or team dynamics, but creating kind of that safe space to provide feedback. So again, these are just a few examples, and here we are at the end. Okay, so the next couple of slides, I just have a list of resources. I'm not going to go through them. You can peruse them on your own, except for these two. I just wanted to highlight sort of some upcoming support information opportunities. So there's actually another webinar, or sorry, a roundtable that's coming up on May 14th. That's hosted by the University of Geneva and the Geneva Tshingwa Institute that I'm actually facilitating. I don't know if Melly is on the call today on the presentation, but Melly Prera, I know she was signed up for the webinar tonight, but if she's on, I'm calling her out without her knowing. But she's actually a keynote speaker. She actually has an amazing example of some of the work that she did with establishing staff care and well-being for her organization, that I think it's Jesuit Refugee Services. So she'll be the keynote speaker. I will be facilitating, and there's a couple other individuals that are kind of experts in the field who are going to be talking about mental health and humanitarians. So that might be of interest. It is a free webinar. There's a link there, and I have a group coaching specifically on burnout. If you're interested, you can follow up with me afterwards. The next couple slides, Christoph, you can just kind of click right through. These are the resources that I often come back to, for me, that have been the most meaningful when I'm looking for ways to give examples or find support. So there's lots of articles, there's manuals, there's trainings. There's also, there's a lot of organizations that are listed, a lot of research from some of the names that I had mentioned earlier. And so that's there for you to look up for wherever you are at in this process, whether you're an individual struggling with stress and burnout and just looking for resource and support, whether you're someone who's responsible for the organizational culture, or working in HR, or trying to, kind of create advocacy messages, whatever it is, there's a lot of resources that can be, can be useful for anyone. So with that, I will leave it. And shall we take a couple-minute break, Christoph, before we open up for questions? Do people need a glass of water, stretch their legs?
Yes, I think that's what we should do. Thank you very much, Kate. This was, again, very, very interesting. A lot of valuable information. Really looking forward to go back and also follow up with some more of those resources. And yes, let's just stretch, maybe get a glass of water, 2-3 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll do some more of a interactive part, questions and answers and so on. And I'm looking forward to, getting also questions from all of you to Kate.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. See you in a minute.
All right, shall we slowly get started again? Kate, how did you imagine? You mentioned that you may have some issues you would like to discuss, or collect feedback from the audience. I don't know if you have a question that can get us rolling here.
Actually, I was thinking to open it up for questions, and then if we have a lull in some of those questions, or as I have questions that can kind of tag on to those, then I can ask them. But if there's then a lull, if we run out of questions, then I can kind of come back to some of those as well. But we'll otherwise just try to link them into the existing questions just to get through some of the requests from participants. So
all right, good. So I would suggest that if somebody has a question, please just unmute yourself and ask. I think we are not too many in this call. Let's just do that. Or if you want to ask a question more anonymously, you could also just text me or Helen, and we will read out the question otherwise. But I'd like to open it up here.
I have a question.
Yes.
Ah,
yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Andres.
So yeah, just I was wondering if you have seen good practices, because one of the things is like, as we said, there is so many. I mean, when we talk about burnout, there is a lot of things that ties back to okay, the organization, but as well the manager, the boss, the leader. I mean, it's different, of course, between the manager and the leader, but still a lot of things comes back to that. And what I've seen as well on the field, it's like a lot of time, for example, you will promote someone to become a manager. For example, is a wash technical person, is very good, is making like a great BOQs, is like, I mean, dealing with this project, with the budget, everything, maybe with the community as well. And then he will be promoted to be a manager, but based on more the technical skill, and he will not be, he or she, of course, will not be accompanied to be a manager, actually. And this is where I see a lot of problems, is like, how can we accompany manager to be manager, and in all these different ways that also you presented, to be a manager, to give feedback and appreciation, to communicate properly, to actively listen, to use empathy with the team, etc. All of these things that will have an impact on the potentiality of developing like a burnout or not. So I was wondering if you had seen some good practices in some organization, because I almost haven't. So yeah.
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks for that. Yeah, I have two examples that come to mind, and two, they're very different approaches. So one is, I was actually working with an organization that was kind of having this tension between management skills and technical skills, and where did that really fall? And because not oftentimes, but they don't always go together. And someone who may be strong in people management skills may not always have the technical capacity. And so it's also looking at organizational structure and helping organizations to maybe shift some of the responsibilities between positions. So balancing, having, not forcing someone who's a technical advisor or technically skilled and gifted to also kind of be strapped with people management, which may not be their strength either. And if it's not their strength, they're probably also not very fulfilled by it. So sometimes that's one way to address it, but it's a much bigger discussion. It's not as easy to address. Another maybe an easier way to address is just having a policy in place that says whenever there's a promotion, that there is a training or some kind of an intentional dialogue with their supervisor, on management skills. If it's something that's clearly not, a part of their CV or their experience, that their supervisor, the supervisor who's hiring, the hiring manager, is able to kind of direct them to some type of management training. And I think that it's easier said than done, but I have seen it done successfully, that whenever there is a promotion or a shift from one type of job to another, that whenever they notice that gap in management skills, and this should be the case anywhere. I mean, I'm an advocate for that in any case, but especially when there's a promotion with someone who doesn't have management skills, that there is just a standard module on how to manage, be a people manager.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Any other questions? We have a question from Emily in the chat box. Christophe, if you want to read it. Christophe, you are mute.
Sorry about that. After more than 1 year pandemic, still not catching up on this. Okay, I wondered if you have any advice on how to engage meaningfully with staff on the topic of welfare burnout in a way that doesn't lead to people feeling they've done or know the topic, particularly in the context of frequent managerial turnover and organizational restructure.
Okay, I'm just going to open up the question really quick so I can see it. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question also. I mean, as we mentioned, the topic of stress and overwhelm and burnout, it is being talked a lot more, especially with COVID. It might be even before that. I mean, these are concepts that we become familiar with. They're in presentations. We get kind of an overview. A lot of the topics that I've discussed, especially early on, they're not unfamiliar, and so we can tend to tune out, a bit when it comes up again. But nevertheless, it's still an important issue. It's still an important concept to really implement within the dynamics of a team. And so I think that that's a really good question on how do you kind of keep it fresh, and how do you kind of draw the importance to it and make it still relevant, even if it's already been talked about. But how can you approach it in different ways that make people feel invested? And I think that that's probably a key part, is asking I think that communicating the message that staff care and well-being and welfare of staff is important, but asking what other elements of that would be helpful and would be meaningful and would be useful, and starting to kind of extract from them what do they want, and kind of making it a priority, saying this isn't going to go away. This is something that's a priority for us, but we want your feedback on how we can make it more meaningful, and what other elements. And so really kind of, I guess, trying to draw from them. I mean, that's the first thing that comes to mind, is getting their participation, because that also creates the buy-in. If you're just kind of presenting the same topic, the same coverage over and over again, then it does get, it's very easy to drown it out. So that would be my kind of the recommendation off the top of my head. It would be to really ask for others, for their feedback, not just feedback, but what do they want to see differently, and also maybe even doing some brainstorming activities together, and where it's not just talk, what there's an action that's going along with it, and what kinds of actions do they want to see, and how are they going to contribute to that, because that also creates the buy-in, but also the accountability.
All right. Anybody else? Anyway, I noticed that Ella, who I think had to leave us already, she left a statement in the chat, and there's also a question attached to it at the end. So let me quickly read that. Maybe if you scroll up a little bit, you'll see. She says, "One thing that puzzles me. It takes an immense amount of energy as an employee to manage upwards, or a manager to foster a supportive team, and then to keep the momentum going. This is draining. At the same time, our jobs requires an immense amount of energy, plus we are constantly acting, reacting, as our work is so dynamic. Yet the incentives of our work, measurement of success, are usually around program, policy, deliverables, ability to fundraise, donor engagement, sector engagements, etc. When we are in the burnout cycle, it takes even more energy to advocate for ourselves and seek support. It's a slippery slope, and we can fall off the edge very quickly.
Yeah.
Where does one start to get out of the murky waters? I think this is why so many end up traumatized, on sick leave, or leave their roles. So yeah, it's like, how do you carve, basically, how do you carve out your own space? How do you, where do you, how can you best start looking after yourself and not just after work? Because there's no KPI usually saying, okay, I'm feeling well and I'm healthy and I'm strong, and it's always about other things.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great comment and question from Ella. And I think this is something that, many of us struggle with, whether we're managers or not. But, how do we take care of ourselves in the midst of these, changing dynamics and complicated, contexts, while still, being responsible for what we need to deliver on. How do we carve out that time? And it's often, the self-care element is often the piece that falls away the fastest. We say, oh, we'll take care of ourselves later. And, there's lots of illustrations for this, of the face mask, on an airplane, that you put your mask on first before you help others. But it's not always that easy. It's a nice visual, but there is this tension of, how do I take care of myself and my responsibilities, or how do I take care of myself and others? And it's both and, it's not so easily, fragmented or dissected. And there's actually a really nice quote, I think, from Desmond Tutu that someone shared with me last week, earlier in the week. And I can't actually remember the quote, but it just talks about how important it is to look upstream, and to start, even though we may be in kind of this pattern of putting band-aids on, and quick fixes to burnout, whether it's self-care or whether we're managing the care and stress levels of our team, but also while we're doing that, having an eye on, looking upstream at where are those problems being formed and what's causing them. And it may not be the direct manager or the direct supervisor that can do that, but the organizational culture should really be, that communication line should be feeding up, so that the organization or those who have that distinct responsibility can be intentionally advocating for and acting on the behalf of those that it's affecting, but may not have the capacity to do so. So it's not one that's easily answered. And, there's lots of things that can be suggested as far as, managing your own self-care, because as a manager, or even as an individual, like you're kind of responsible for that, and being aware that the message that you're sending when you take care of when you're doing self-care, or when you're not taking your leave or doing self-care, the message and the model that you're sending then to your team also, that they should be doing the same. And so we're kind of recognizing the patterns that are being reinforced and what's being communicated by those behaviors. So it's not something that's easy answered, and it's a both and. And when one set, whether it's an individual, a manager, or a team, doesn't have the capacity because of their unique context, there should be that mechanism where they can rely on, the regional office or the HQ office or the HR team, or not. And I'm not saying that staff care and well-being is responsibility of HR by any means. That's not my philosophy, but it's just one example of, I think, the norm. But really, kind of encouraging an organization to be proactive, that they have that responsibility to provide environments that are safe and healthy, and where people can kind of take that time and not feel guilty about self-care, and kind of carving out that taking their day off, taking their R&R, setting boundaries and saying no to certain things, that they're not going to be made to feel guilty. And so it is really on the organizational culture as well. So really looking at who's going to be responsible for that, and where does that custodianship lie? Because ultimately someone does have to do it.
So Kate, a follow-up question from Daniela. Is there any research on why people might not reach out for support?
The research, not concrete like study, but there is a lot of data, and some of what I shared earlier in the presentation, just some of those barriers and some of like the mindsets that we have, and what we tell ourselves and why we don't want to reach out for support. But that's more on an individual level. From an organizational level, I think one of the most common ones that I hear is that there's fear of being seen as not capable, and fear of their job being put in jeopardy because they can't seem to manage it when maybe they're not actually the ones that should be. So I don't know that there's actually really concrete research that I'm aware of for that specific element, but there's a lot of data that has been collected and shared. And a lot of it is actually in the resource list that I had. So the CHS Alliance mapping, and also some of the research from Liza Yatkins, I would highly recommend as well.
Cool. A good question from Pete and Tom in the DRC. Cinema. Are you aware of any films that look at the question of burnout? Because obviously that would be a great way to learn about it.
That's a really good question. No, I don't. Nothing's coming to mind, but that's a really great question, and it'd be an excellent medium on how to communicate.
And maybe somebody else in the audience, if you know of something, either maybe a movie or even a book or a story, or I'm sure that must have been picked up in one way or another somewhere. No?
I really like that idea, though. I'm going to have to look into that. I keep thinking of the movie. I don't know if you know the cartoon Inside Out. I think it's a Disney Pixar movie, but it's such a powerful movie on how you communicate emotions, and kind of the emotional processing to children, at a very different level. But it's just an example of how powerful, different mediums can be. And so I think I really like the idea of movies. I'll have to look into that. Thanks for the idea.
Thanks. I'm Pete. This is Tom. I wonder if you could speak to the importance of the starting assumptions that we have. I once went to an onboarding session that really saw a contract in the field as a slow slide to burnout, and the onus was sort of on you to try and slow the slide. And my perspective was quite different to that, and really believing that I could thrive in the role and continue and enjoy it and feel fulfilled. And so I wonder, if you could speak to starting with good assumptions about how we can find a way to thrive and expect to thrive, because there are so many things that I think do enable us to do that. I think we can often have a very special experience of work and work with some people who are extremely capable and motivated, and with whom we share a lot of values. And so if you could speak a little bit to that, then that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Thanks. I think traditionally, stress and burnout, managing your stress, and if you experience things like overwhelm and burnout, that really has traditionally been put on the individual and thought of as it being an individual problem. And as we looked at, so what are some of those organizational and occupational factors that actually contribute to it? And it's not about the individual, but really about the environment that they're in. And I think that some of being able to kind of reframe the way that we think about stress and burnout, and increasing awareness, not just self-awareness, but also organizational awareness, and kind of understanding. So like in the example of an onboarding process, where some of that, I don't know what specifically what your experience was, but creating space to kind of say that it's okay, that you may experience this, you may not, it doesn't, these contexts don't affect or apply to everyone the same, but if you experience it, this is, a safe space, and this is what we want to create, so that you can feel like you can get the support that you need, so that you can also feel like you can continue to engage freely in the work that you feel, called to do and passionate about. And so I think, again, it's it's becoming just a very big mindset shift, on how organizations have treated stress, how we as individuals have viewed stress, and so often we've taken that on ourselves as well. Not because of organizations have necessarily told us, but just we have that as humans. I think we just have that tendency to say that something's wrong with us, that we can't cope, that we can't manage, and that we compare ourselves to other people. We say that, we shouldn't feel this way because, we're working in difficult contexts, other people have it worse. A lot of those things, in the slide that had kind of the, barriers to stress management, I think, a lot of those, you really start to examine the mindset that we tend to have and the things that we tend to tell ourselves. And so it really is being very intentional about how do we counter that, and put that back on, organizations, and really, encourage them to be supportive and have kind of open that dialogue. But I really, want to stress that it is an organizational responsibility. And I want to, as much as I love to see it when organizations are taking steps of providing well-being workshops and webinars and trainings, even this, if just for example, if an organization says, hey, we're going to make a list of all these, mental health and stress and burnout webinars that we know about, it's on you, it's your responsibility to go and check them out, and maybe you'll glean something, maybe you'll learn something. But that, again, just because they're providing a list of resources, it puts the responsibility back on the individual, which really isn't a very proactive approach. It's very reactive and just looking for quick fixes, hoping that someone else will do the work instead of looking at the larger organizational structure, which is what is the biggest contributing factor to how an individual experiences stress, in the field with the people that they're working with. So I don't think it's a very easy answer to what you were asking, but that's a little bit about kind of my philosophy and how I see it, and how I've seen organizations start to change, how they've implemented different interventions that were much more with the onus on the individual, to then starting to take it more on themselves to provide kind of this culture. And I'm going to quote, I think it's a culture of care and compassion. This is taken from, again, the CHS Alliance mapping, is really their initiative, is helping organizations to create this culture of care and compassion. I think I'm saying it right, but anyways, I hope that speaks a bit to your question.
Thanks. I have another question, if I may. So just to speak a little bit to the tension between a sense of proximity and solidarity with the people that we serve. We're sort of in the business of relieving suffering, and I think proximity to that suffering can wear on us as individuals. But equally, if we go too far the other way and we're sort of insulated from that and in our sort of comfortable bubbles, that might be a team residence, or it might be a really luxurious R&R or something. How do we find the right balance between those? Because at one point I see distance from suffering as key to sort of working sustainably and taking care of oneself, but equally that proximity remains important too.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Thanks for that. Yeah, also not an easy one to answer, to address. And you're right. And I think, the proximity that an individual, that's working in the sector has to suffering has a very profound impact on how they experience stress or stressors. And this is, I think this is why this is so, I think that there's a higher prevalence in this sector, or at least within helping professions. So this is very common for police officers, nurses, doctors, anyone who's in a profession that has a very close proximity to human suffering has a higher tendency to experience overwhelm and burnout at a higher rates, higher prevalence than in other occupations. So, but I think that there is something that's very essential in that, as you were kind of alluding to, is that having that sense of interaction, with a community, affected population, people group, but wherever that suffering is, to be able to be in it but not be affected by it, it's very hard, and it's a very fine line, and everyone experiences that differently. Some people have a very high threshold for suffering. Some people, I mean, there is I don't know if you're aware of, there's actually a technical term that was recently coined. I think it's highly sensitive person, also highly sensitive child, so HSC and HSP. So some people are just very, very emotional, very, very sensitive, and have a high sensitivity to what other people, around them are doing and how they're experiencing. And so it really depends on the individual, on how you experience that proximity to suffering, and how you manage that. It really comes back to self-awareness, I think, is key, and kind of understanding your own reactions and responses to stress. So I talked about, like, there's an activity that I do sometimes with clients where we build their own, a very unique, very personalized, very subjective scale, so that they understand their own stressors, and their own behaviors and responses to stress, so that they can look at themselves, and look on the scale, or on this timeline, as to what they're experiencing, to know how they should be responding, what kinds of, having that kind of preventative strategy in place already before it's needed is really important. But we don't always take the time to do that, because taking the time to take care of ourselves seems very luxurious. And that's where that sense of guilt comes in, is that if we're taking time for ourselves, then we're not spending the time that maybe we should on other people. So it is a tension, but everyone experiences it quite differently. But it really comes down to things like, our own mindset, having a very high self-awareness level of stress, how we respond, but also being able to kind of communicate that, and kind of nurture a healthy relationship with management, managers, leadership, to be able to kind of communicate your needs, and also establish some accountability in what we're expecting managers to do in support of that.
There's another very interesting question here, Kate. Any specific research or good practices you know of on the impact of a buddy system or a peer-to-peer support system in decreasing stress, or even decreasing the risk of burnout? Yeah,
I don't know of specific research. I know that there have been studies and academic articles, journals have been posted in journals that have studied peer support systems, and the value of sense of community, and how the sense of community within your work environment contributes positively to your sense of well-being and the reduction of stress. And I'm not sure if I might actually have that referenced in the list at the end of the presentation slides. I can't make any concrete references to it right now. But I do know for sure that I've seen it exists. I can't remember the name or who it's by right now, but I'll try and find it and send it out.
Yeah, that'd be interesting, because I'd personally be interested in knowing about that particular thing. Yes, very, very good question. Thank you. Anybody else? Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm just wondering, what's the balance with, like, I'm a country director, so what's the balance with your team? So there's this kind of delicate balance right now that we have in our team. I think that there's things that I'm struggling with that I don't really know how much I can really share with my team, or how vulnerable I can be with my team without coming across as not being able to lead. And then how do I also encourage my team? I'm watching a few of them on a road to burnout, but I mean, it doesn't matter what I say about resilience or taking rest, or modeling, even for me to model it for them, but them still not taking it. And how do I help them see that? I think there's this weird dynamic to, both things happening at the same time. And I'm not always really sure how to address it. Or how to be honest about where I'm at either, really, without coming across as a weak leader.
Yeah, no, that's, again, thanks for the question, and also for being so open for sharing that in this forum. And I think that that's something that that a lot of managers struggle with as well. Not being sure how much of their own struggles to be open and vulnerable with and transparent about, because on one hand managers do lead by example, and being able to be vulnerable and to show that they're not perfect and not superhuman takes some intentional sharing. But how when is sharing too much? How much is too much, and what are you risking if you share? And there is the risk in that, but I think so much of our work is dependent on the relationships that we have, and I think only you know that, you know your context. But there is actually so I don't have an easy answer for that either, but it is definitely worth taking some time to reflect and seeking support on what from your supervisor or external. I will say that there's actually some, I don't know if it's research yet, if it's been published, or there's a book coming out. Gemma Holdley is also speaks to this actually quite a bit, and he speaks a lot about kind of the vulnerable humanitarian. And there's a really great podcast with her and Melissa Patotti as well, where she's being interviewed and kind of talking about this this dynamic, or this sense of feeling that we have to kind of portray ourselves as the strong leader, and but how do you balance that? But I mean, that doesn't necessarily serve the best purpose, right? I mean, being able to be compassionate with ourselves also communicates compassion to our team, and they are sensitive to that. I mean, especially in contexts where life and work are, where that line of living together and working together is very, very thin or non-existent, that it leaks out, the way that we talk, that we treat ourselves and kind of understand our own process. Even if we're holding that back, it does leak out into those environments. And so it is important. It's an important question to ask yourself, and to kind of find the balance. But and again, I struggle a little bit even using the word balance. I think, I think it's always in flux. I think it's, it really kind of depends on the day and the dynamic and the temperature of the team. And, there's a lot of elements that contribute to that. So I'm sorry, I don't have a more concrete way to address it. But I mean, it's very common. I mean, it's such a common question, I think, from people who are responsible for managing teams on, how much is too much to share, but also wanting to create that culture of kind of compassion and vulnerability, and understanding that it goes a long way to establish trust as well.
What was the name? Gemma who?
Gemma Holdley. It's Gemma. Last name is Houldey. And she she actually just did her I think her PhD dissertation on this as well, and is publishing a book later this year. So I definitely recommend looking into her work.
Yeah, and just to let you know, we're planning to do a webinar with her, which will most likely be happening in September.
Oh, fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Any more questions? Anyone? I mean, we are approaching 8 o'clock. So, sorry, somebody started to talk.
It's not so much. It's not so much a question. It's just maybe an observance. For me, there's kind of two groups of people we haven't really talked about here. One is donors, and I mean, a lot of the constriction, as we know, is tight budgets, reducing staff, numbers, etc., etc. So it's a big conversation, but to basically get them on board from an organizational point of view. The second group of people is national staff.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes back into Peter Tom, who mentioned about proximity to suffering from beneficiaries. But I mean, we in the global north have the luxury of R&Rs, extended leave, and we can take time out potentially between contracts. National staff are living in these contexts, and they can't escape the area that they're living in, and oftentimes they're working purely from a financial point of view to meet the needs of their family. and there's no way they can admit to burnout or cracking up because they may lose their job. So it takes a creative manager to kind of look out for these guys and to, in a culturally appropriate way, to actually address all of the stuff that is that they're going through as well.
Great points. I want to address both. I know we're tight on time. I don't know if I have permission to go a few minutes over for those that are interested. For the donors, first of all, I am a huge advocate of donor education, of the importance for staff care and well-being, and have been on projects, where we're designing the project, we're designing the budget with specific, again, going back to where do you show your time and your money, but building into project budgets line items for staff care and well-being, whether that's training, whether that's workshops, whether that's management modules. So being very intentional about including that and showing your donors that that's a priority, but also going to the level of engaging with donors in conversation about educating them on how this the context stress affects the context, and if you have to put it into frame it in the context of financial implications and meeting deadlines and deliverables, like how often are those at risk when we have high staff turnover, or staff that are constantly sick or needing to care for other things. There is a way to communicate with donors to educate them on the importance, not just that it's about bottom line, right? But that's one way that kind of gets them to perk up a little bit. But then talking about the humanity of that and caring for the people who are ultimately carrying out these missions and these projects. And so being very intentional and having the space to include, even if it's a small budget, it's a start, and so just including them as line items, having intentional conversations on to educate donors, I think is really important. And and I think there is an increase in funding that I've seen from certain donors on certain projects that I've been a part of, where we've actually implemented that. So I like to think that there's there's hope in that, but I think it needs to be, that they need to be involved in those kinds of conversations that are happening with organizations. So for your second point, and talking with people on national contracts, and I tried to put pieces of it in the presentation a bit, talking about cultural considerations, talking about the inequity, the lack of fairness, and it's very evident in the way that contracts are even structured, and the policies that provide support, and whether even if I've seen some examples of organizations saying, okay, well, we're going to just take our EAP, our employee assistance program that we make accessible to our staff on international contracts, and then we can just pare it down a bit and make the same package in some form accessible to our staff on national contracts. But it doesn't work that way. You've got a lot of cultural context and language and just accessibility issues, and so it can't just be like this cookie cutter approach. But I think that really falls on country offices as well. When country offices have or regional offices, that there's an intentional investment into understanding, even understanding what the concept of stress and well-being are within that culture, because the idea of stress, the idea of burnout does not always translate well. And so how do we talk about it? How do we make it okay? Is there stigma about it? Is there even acceptance that it exists, or is there a word that exists? And so being very intentional, but it goes back to the organizational responsibility, I believe.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think this is a good ending to this evening. Thank you, Kate, for being available again, having been available again for another one of those sessions. It was very inspiring and interesting. And I definitely look forward to continue collaborating with you and through CCH.
Thank you so much. Thank you for again, for the opportunity to just to support the work that CCH is doing. And yeah, it's been a privilege and a pleasure. And for those that still want to continue some dialogue and still have some questions, please feel free to reach out at any time. You have my contact information, the website, and some of the projects that I work with. So please feel free to reach out. I would love to hear from you and keep the conversation going.
Yeah, I also just wanted to say that we will send out a little survey later on this evening. We want to get some feedback from you, what you liked, etc. But also we're asking for suggestions. We continue with our series of webinars. Maybe these different topics, maybe you know some good speakers, etc. Please let us know. And the recording of the session and the PowerPoint will be available. We'll send you an email with the link to it on our website. They're going to be downloadable.
Yes, and something I would like to add. So thanks a lot for connecting with us, all of you. Some of you already know CoCreate Humanity. For some of you, it's the first webinar with CoCreate Humanity. So the next webinar will be end of May with Fiona Dunkley on the topic of from breakdown to breakthrough, the roadmap to trauma care. And at the end of June, we will have the pleasure to welcome Professor Alain Brunet from McGill University. He will present something about PTSD and the reconsolidation therapy for the humanitarian sector. So as Christophe said, we're going to send you a survey. This is, if you could please take the time to fill it in. We need you to continue our initiative. CoCreate Humanity has been created very recently in August 2019. And we do exist because of humanitarian workers and for humanitarian workers. So you can follow up our work on LinkedIn, on the Facebook as well. We also have a YouTube channel. We've done a very nice concert to commemorate this community a few weeks ago. And yes, we hope to welcome you very soon. And thanks again for your presence tonight.